product. Um, Next up, I got a really interesting question. When I was eating a little bit, and then somebody said, "Do you think we can fix Brexit with blockchain?" And I was like, I didn't know what to answer. Anyway, it's a very good question to ask tonight if you're having drinks with friends. Just say like, "I think we can fix Brexit with blockchain," and then everybody will be like, "Uh huh." Next up is Peter Todd. He is one of the core developers of the Bitcoin protocol, if I'm correct. And Peter, you're based out of Canada?
Yeah, Toronto.
Toronto, beautiful city, but traveling a lot and spreading the gospel.
Something like that.
Okay. All the best.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm from Toronto. I have done work on Bitcoin Core, although if you look at the actual code base for probably the past year and a bit, I haven't contributed much lately. What I have been working on is a few other projects. One of them's open timestamps, and let's get right into it. And of course, you're going to talk about project. You might as well ask, well, I mean, what is a timestamp? And the kind of glib way to go talk about it is, well, carbon dating for data. You know, and if I say have an old document, an old artifact or something, of course, if you all know carbon dating, that lets me know how old is that thing. The digital equivalent is digital cryptographic timestamping. You know, this is also not a new concept, but we can do some more interesting things with it. But the real question, of course, is, well, why do we actually need this? I mean, why would this be useful? And really, I think this picture sums it up, which is that that's a time machine, and attackers don't have one. And what that really means is, if I can prove digital data existed in the past, and I think an attack might have happened not that far back, because attackers don't have a time machine, I can go say something about the digital data, like maybe the attack couldn't have happened. You know, a concrete example of this actually comes up in Bitcoin development itself. I mean, that's an actual Bitcoin git commit. You probably can't read that too easily, but that's from Peter Wool. And, you know, that's a digital signature on some of the code. And it's read because Peter Wool's private key got compromised. You know, apparently he left it on a server, password protected, but, you know, precautionary measure, he revoked it. Now, the thing is, how can I then know if that digital signature was valid? I mean, if the attacker did get it, that date on that git commit might be fake. I know roughly when the key might have been compromised. Well, if I had a cryptographic timestamp on it, I could say, well, you know, attack might have happened here. That was created there. That lets me know that chances are that digital signature is okay. And here's another example, again from Bitcoin Core. Might be one of the more recent commits I made in February 19th, 2017. That one's actually timestamped with open timestamps. So Bitcoin is showing that that digital signature existed, you know, roughly around that time. Another example is an interesting thing called Airproof, which actually uses open timestamps. And the idea is that, well, let's suppose I have an Airbnb or, you know, similar rental thing. I might want to go and prove that I didn't go trash the place. Now, an obvious way to do that is take some photos when you get in there. You know, go and show that here's the status of the rental. Now, that by itself is probably enough to be convincing, but, you know, show that at least when I got in and when I got out, the status was this, and obviously it wasn't trash then, so when the place got trashed was, you know, before or after I went and left the facilities. Now, you might want to think about this point a bit more, but maybe let's go define this a little more precisely and say, well, what are we proving? Well, it's a proof that a message M existed prior to time t. If I can prove that, that lets us do all these great things. Of course, why is proof in quotation marks? Well, math doesn't have a concept of time. It's just an equation. So we're not actually proving that. What we can actually prove is something we call a commitment. And what that is saying, well, rather than proving directly that the message existed prior to the time, we can instead say, I can prove that one message existed prior to another message. This creates a relationship. And if you're familiar with hash functions, well, you might be able to think of an example of how you might go prove that. For instance, here I have a message, hello world, and I have a very big number, so big in fact it goes off the edge of the screen. And what that hash function is proving is, well, because I can't construct the number from the message, obviously the message existed prior to the number. Or sorry, can't construct the message from the can't construct the number. Where was that again? Can't construct the number without the message. The message existed prior to the number. There you go. I think I got that one right. But can we go generalize this a bit more? This is just one example. Maybe we could go and get a little more detail and call the notion of a commitment operation. And what's important for our case, and the people a bit more familiar will say a whole bunch of other stuff that could be true here, but that we have this mathematical function h, takes a message, produces a digest, and given the output, you can't find a different message such that that message produces the same digest. Right? So a little bit more concrete here. Well, here's an interesting thing. Can you think of an example of a commitment operation that isn't a hash function? What's some function they can push in a message, and it comes out a digest, and you can't change the output, or can't change the input without changing the output. Well, just prepend and append works, right? They're commitment operations. I've something called prepend hello. I take in a message and I prepend hello to it. That's a valid commitment operation. Seems kind of trivial, but is valid. Well, I can also go chain these things. Again, the input-output relationship holds. Very, very all nice. And again, if I change hello world, the output would obviously go change. And finally, I have one last bit of the puzzle, which is, well, I can have attestation. Now, this is different from all the math. This is saying, I know when this bit of data, if you will, existed. This happens to be something called publication made by a company called GuardTime. They literally take a hash digest and they publish it in a newspaper. Well, what's our threat model here? Could someone go and take, all the newspapers and go and swap out that number with another one? Probably not. Of course, we do have a practical problem, which is, verifying this is difficult. But at least with all these other tools, we could construct a proof saying, I have my message, I do some operations to it, and eventually it ends up in a newspaper that's difficult to go modify, and I know when that newspaper existed, in this case July 17th, 2009. So finally, for our last bit of the puzzle, can we make this a little simpler? Can we verify this more robustly? And of course, you can. Well, this is how Open Timestamps ends up working, which is, for various reasons, Bitcoin blocks have a time attached to them. And the reason why they do is really gets down to the proof of work, which is, as you may have heard earlier, you need to retarget that difficulty so that an even number of blocks get created. But we can leverage this for our own purposes, because if we can go and prove that some message was committed by some block, then we know when that message must have existed prior, assuming that we have some rough trust in the date on that block. In this case, I've verified that this 37 EC, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, existed prior to April 23rd, 2013. So now with all that out of the way, let's maybe go under the hood a bit. How does this actually work in Open Timestamps? In the command line tool actually has a little subcommand, lets you go and figure out what operations are being done. Well, here's really how it works, is that an Open Timestamps proof is just a series of these commitment operations. Because remember, we showed every operation has the property that if the input changes, the output must change. We can go chain these operations, and we know which ones are mathematically valid. So at the very start, we take our file, and we hash it with ripemd, then we prepend some big string to it, we append some big string to it, we hash it again and again with SHA-256, append, prepend, etc., etc. And eventually, at the very bottom, now we have this verify command. It's saying, verify that Bitcoin block header 232, 2032,756 has the exact same Merkle root as whatever happens to be produced by the end of these attestation, or by the end of these commitment operations. And again, this is a math proof. I mean, you could literally sit there with a Python shell and manually do it yourself, and you would get the same result, assuming you typed in all the numbers right. So that's all well and good. I mean, I think we can trust the math. We know this works. So let's ask another question. I mean, how would I actually get this into a Bitcoin block? Well, this particular one, an Open Timestamp, is a little clever, and it will actually try to reverse engineer the proof. It thinks, all right, that looks like a Bitcoin block. It probably was. And sure enough, you can go put one of these, the digest of your message into a Bitcoin transaction, and say an op return. But that's kind of expensive, and it's also kind of slow. When you actually run Open Timestamps, it's a lot faster than that. That's, again, a real command line example of timestamping a file. And I have the time command there, and that completed in about a bit over a second. Well, yeah, 1.7 seconds. So how did that happen? Well, there's one more trick up our sleeve, which is the idea of a calendar. And this, again, is a timestamp proof, but it's incomplete because, all right, we SHA-256, we append, but now it splits. And rather than verifying against a Bitcoin block, we verified against something called pending attestation. And all that is saying, I trust this remote server to eventually timestamp this document. Well, what did that server do? I mean, I submitted my request. It promises to timestamp it. Well, in the background, it'll actually create a Merkle tree, eventually create a Bitcoin transaction, and so on. But the important thing is, you, the verifier, don't need to know this. You can come back later and say, hey, did you actually do this? And the server will say, yeah, I did. Give you the rest of the proof, and now we're back to this proof terminating in Bitcoin. And what's really going on behind the scenes, which, again, you don't really need to know as a user, is, say if all of you right now contact these servers asking to timestamp data, it would actually build a Merkle tree for that 1 second and save the tip of that. And again, just give you back these partial proofs. But again, does this change the validity of the math? No, it doesn't really matter. So between that, well, now we have convenient, free, digital timestamping proof. We can use it for whatever we want. But there is a catch, which is timestamps aren't actually as useful as you might think. Like you might remember earlier on, I gave this example of AirProof, but I really kind of glossed over what actually is happening there. I'm like, let's think about it for a second. I enter an Airbnb, I take some photos, and I prove those photos existed before a point in time. I prove that when I entered, the apartment was clean. There were no holes in the walls. The toilet hadn't been smashed in a wild party. But then I go leave the apartment, and I go take some more photos. that show the same thing. But a timestamp didn't prove the right thing. A timestamp said those photos existed prior to point in time. How do you know I didn't just take 2 sets of photos and wait to timestamp the second one? Maybe I did that, had my wild party, and now I go off to the host and say, hey, I've got this great evidence. I'm a nice guy. It wasn't me who went and smashed the toilet. Unfortunately, airproof doesn't actually quite work. It does half the job, but not the other half. And I find a lot of timestamping stuff has issues like this. The other big problem is people often mistake timestamping for preventing double spends. And here's an example, say a title deed. So let's suppose I have a house. Now, that house, I have a digital signature, and I'm selling you that house. And I then have evidence for another chain of digital signatures that that house was real when I bought it. And we can go back all the way to whenever we went and stole the land from whoever had it before. I guess here was the Romans or something. Quite a while back. But the timestamp only showed that these records were old. They didn't show that they were unique. And again, I see this a lot. Many people make this kind of mistake. So for that, I'm working on another project called Proof Marshal. And the idea there is you have this sort of concept of a digital seal, where they're uniquely numbered, and they can be only closed once. So this is kind of like, the digital equivalent of things you see on shipping containers. I have a container full of goods. It leaves, Canada or something, goes across the ocean, arrives here in London, and if I can verify that the number on the seal is correct, I know that whatever was sealed in the beginning is the same at the end. So the digital equivalent, I have a seal, it's uniquely numbered, I close it, then I have a witness proving that it was the same data. Once you implement this primitive, of course, you can go and do a whole lot of interesting protocols. Unfortunately, looking at the clock and also looking at the timer, I'm certainly not going to explain to you all this wonderful protocols, but I will go and essentially leave you with, think very hard about what you're trying to actually go prove. Because a lot of people kind of make these mistakes. And, I really wanted to have this talk be an inaccessible one for, the people here who may not have understood, say, C.K. Starks. But with that, give it a try.
Thank you, Peter. What's your next destination?
Milan, then New York, and maybe Toronto if I'm lucky.
Okay, so how many cities have you been traveling over in the last year?
Look at this way. In my first year of this, I've managed to go fill up 1 passport.
Okay. Okay, so yeah, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And for the talk. Give him an extra round of applause while we set this up. We're now diving into London and what London is doing for blockchain and cryptocurrency. So I'd like to invite on stage Jeremy Kahn. He's a senior writer at Bloomberg News. Here, he's working out a new building here, beautiful building. He covers technology, including blockchain and cryptocurrency-related subjects. Jeremy, can I ask you to join me on stage? Hopefully you can introduce the rest of the panel.
Okay, yeah.
And take it away.
Absolutely. So I'll ask my other panelists to come on up. First, we've got Patrick McCrory.
Oh, that's a different Patrick.
Yeah, not this Patrick. Yeah.
I thought he was talking about Patrick. Yeah.
Patrick is a research associate at UCL. His focus is on cryptocurrencies, smart contracts, cryptography, and decentralized systems. He was the UK's first PhD graduate in cryptocurrencies, and his work has been presented at a bunch of important conferences: DEF CON 3, Scaling Bitcoin 2017, Breaking Bitcoin 2017, and BPAYS 2018. Next to him, we have George Morris, who is a managing associate here in this building at Simmons & Simmons, specializing in technology and regulatory and contract issues. He joined Simmons & Simmons in 2007 and has worked on a wide variety of clients from large international financial institutions all the way down to sort of fintech startups and other technology startups. He specializes in digital currencies and legal and regulatory issues surrounding those entities. Next, we've got Jack coming up, Jack Gavigan. He's the Chief Operating Officer of Zcash, which is the first open and permissionless cryptocurrency that protects transaction privacy using zero knowledge of cryptography. So maybe we can talk about that too. He's worked at some of the world's top financial services companies prior to that and has an extensive background in financial technology, cybersecurity, and trading systems. He's also been an advisor to the UK government on digital currencies and blockchain technology, so he'll be well poised to talk about those issues. And finally, we've got Tim Nugent, who's a senior research scientist at Thomson Reuters, where he specializes in machine learning and also blockchain technologies. He's been a leader on a number of their blockchain initiatives, and we can talk a bit about that as well. Great, so that's our panel. I'll just start out by saying that, the topic is sort of how is London doing on blockchain, and in general, it's been a pretty friendly environment here in London. There's, the regulator has been pretty open to experimentation with cryptocurrencies and with digital ledger systems, but there's some sense that might change. I mean, there's a Treasury Select Committee currently looking at cryptocurrencies. There's the FCA doing an ongoing rulemaking kind of exercise that may result in something at the end. And you have politicians now, including the Prime Minister, making noise about money laundering and cryptocurrencies, and does something need to be done to make sure that these entities aren't abused. So maybe we can sort of talk about where the environment is and where the environment is going. Maybe we can start down at the end with Patrick. I mean, what's your sense of where London is right now from a kind of regulatory standpoint, and how that's affecting how things are developing here?
I don't know too much on the regulatory front.
Okay.
So I'm in academia.
Well, may give it to George.
So I can talk about an academic perspective, I guess, in terms of the universities and how they're treating cryptocurrency research.
Yeah.
So when I started in 2013, several people warned me not to do any research on it because if I did, it would fail and I wouldn't really have a PhD. Where now, if you look at the UK universities now, I mean, you have the UCL Blockchain Centre. We have many blockchain researchers now. You have Imperial, they have Arthur, he's amazing. King's College also is hiring a blockchain researcher. In Northern England, there's lots of universities. In fact, if you even go on the jobs at ac.uk, a lot of the PhD students, like PhD offers, are for blockchain. So the universities have certainly picked up on it in the UK.
Right.
Well, and then I'll let you move on to regulation.
Yeah, so that's a sort of on the talent front.
Exactly, talent front. I mean, actually teaching people how this technology works,
right,
and then filtering them in the industry.
And the universities seem to have gotten over their hesitancy to be involved in these.
I think so. Universities can be quite slow sometimes, especially with new technology that they don't really know. I mean, they can be a bit scared because you're gambling on the fact that this is going to be really useful in the future. Because if you don't as it was mentioned earlier, our research is sort of judged by how many citations and what our peers think as well.
Right.
Yeah.
George, since you do specialize in regulation, how do you sort of see the situation here in the UK shaping up, particularly compared to some other jurisdictions, some of which are really trying to plow ahead and establish themselves as go-to destinations for, if you want to establish an ICO, if you want to create a new coin, this is the place to come. And London's kind of been, well, we won't say no, but we're maybe not as welcoming as some others. How do you sort of see it?
Yeah, I think it's a very good way of describing it. I think as a lawyer working in practice and actually trying to advise companies doing ICOs, launching digital currency products, one of the key things that we would like more of is certainty. So it's exactly what you've just suggested, that the UK hasn't said no, but equally they haven't said yes. So you've got places like Gibraltar, places like Malta, who are saying yes, and they're desperately trying to get this business in through the door, just in the same way that Gibraltar did back in the early 2000s with the gaming industries. So they're doing the same thing. They're creating regulations to try and encourage these businesses to come to their countries. In the UK, we're being much more cautious, so watching and waiting and seeing how these things develop. The issue we have with that is that people are trying to do things in the UK. They don't necessarily understand whether or not they're legal, and we don't necessarily, as lawyers, we're not really able to say whether or not they're legal. We can give a good academic viewpoint as to whether we feel they are or they're not, but we can't ever say, and this is absolutely nailed on. And I think that's a big problem we're having in the UK at the moment. If you go to Gibraltar, you go to Malta, if you're launching an ICO, you can say, yes, in Gibraltar it's legal. In the UK, you can say, it looks okay, but we'll probably need to check with the FCA. The interesting thing about this area, though, is that you go to Gibraltar and you launch an ICO. You might be compliant in Gibraltar, but you're never going to do an ICO that's just confined to Gibraltar investors. You are asking for investment across the globe, and so even though you might be launching your ICO in Gibraltar, and you have certainty in Gibraltar, you don't have certainty anywhere else. So the reality is that although we haven't got the certainty in the UK, you don't really have certainty across the entire globe. So every single one of these launches has a certain element of legal risk to it.
Right. Jack, you've helped advise the UK government on some of this. What's your sense of what they're thinking and what direction the kind of regulatory winds are blowing on this?
I think so. My involvement in giving them advice and education in this space dates back to 2015, so about 3 years. And back then, there was a real interest, and I think that was borne out later on when they allocated £10 million to the Turing Institute, which I believe is the source of some of this funding for the universities. But they were really interested in this as a technology, and blockchain technology in particular, and also what. They do view the two things as being distinct and separate, cryptocurrency and blockchain technology, but also what it means, what cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, as it was at the time, really means for the City of London, for the UK's financial sector, and this was obviously pre the Brexit vote and so on. So that was the kind of the source of their interest. There was very high level interest at the cabinet level, and then that filtered out. Like I said, there was then a report produced by the government's chief scientist, Professor Mark Walpole, and then funding was made available. I feel like since then there's been a bit of a stalling, and I think you're absolutely right. They haven't come out and said that it's illegal or that they don't approve of digital currency activity and so on, but they haven't given that signal, and it's been very clear in some of the quotes that have come out around reports in the space about why companies in the UK are struggling to get bank accounts. The excuses given by the banks include, and I'm paraphrasing here, that there hasn't been a strong signal from the government or the regulator that this sort of activity is okay. And as a result, that means that banks who are naturally conservative and wary of ending up on the receiving end of large fines for any association with money laundering, they're very wary about giving accounts to cryptocurrency exchanges or even companies. And I think this is more through ignorance than real risk averseness. Any company that has any association whatsoever with blockchain technology. So I feel like the regulators and the government here have been lagging behind a little bit, and we see Switzerland and Luxembourg taking this business, which naturally belongs in the UK, naturally belongs in the City of London, which has been a financial capital for centuries and has been a very, very strong centre for financial technology for over 100 years. That business is now starting to move overseas, and it's very disappointing.
Right. I kind of have one point to that as well, actually. So this is back in 2013 when I was trying to buy some Bitcoin. You're completely right about the banks being adverse to it. So when I was dealing with a local trader, he says, Patrick, when you send me the money, can you put the reference as an Xbox game? And I'm like, an Xbox game of what? Like £600 or something? He's like, yeah, because if you don't and you say Bitcoin, they're going to shut down my account. Right. So even local traders, you're just trying to buy and sell this and get these cryptocurrencies out there to the public. They're feeling the heat. I don't know if it's still the case now, but it certainly was 2 or 3 years ago.
Well, I think at the moment, currently, First of all, there aren't many cryptocurrency exchanges in the UK. There was a major one that was primarily based here called Bitstamp. They've now moved their main center of gravity to Luxembourg. And I think that cryptocurrency exchanges want AML and KYC regulation to be applied because it makes things simpler for them. It avoids all these scaremongering tactics and worries about the banks. And to be honest, I do think that the regulators here have been too slow to move on that front.
Interesting. I want to get Tim in here. Patrick talked a little bit about what's happening in sort of the academic talent space. Tim, maybe you can talk a little about what's happening in large financial institutions here. A lot of the really interesting pilot projects on digital ledger keeping, on using blockchains for smart contracts, are taking place here in London. Isn't that right?
Yes, I would agree with that. To speak to my own company, Thomson Reuters, large global corporation, 45,000 people or so. We probably have about 15, 20 people globally working on blockchain, distributed ledger technology, and I would say the vast majority of those people are based here in London. We've got a strong engineering team, and I'm part of the research and development group that work on those sorts of projects. Also looking to our customers. I mean, we're an enterprise. We listen to our customers' needs and requirements, and I would say the two major platforms that they are looking to at the moment would be R3's Corda platform. R3 I think they have offices in London and New York, but again, I understand that most of their engineering does happen here in London. And then the other platform or protocol is Ethereum and the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance. I'm not sure the numbers now, but upwards of about 200 companies or so, but certainly a large presence in London. I think there's a meetup later this evening. I think one of the major banks that has made significant contributions to pushing forwards Ethereum and enterprise versions of that is JP Morgan. And Jack, you've worked with them integrating Zcash. I think their development teams are split between London and New York, but certainly a heavy presence in London. And I suppose that mirrors the fact that both London and New York are global financial centres. So I see a lot of activity in the enterprise space, and certainly very encouraging.
Right. One of the big things happening here, obviously, is Brexit. And what does Brexit potentially mean for this pool of talent and for some of the activity that's happening around blockchain and around cryptocurrencies here in London? I mean, Patrick, you were saying that a lot of academics don't really want to come to the UK anymore.
I think that's becoming apparent, yeah. So, I mean, ever since Brexit, I mean, most researchers in the UK, a huge population of the researchers are international by nature. I mean, we have some of the best universities in the world. And the moment you say, oh, we don't want you in our country, we want Brexit and we want hard borders, that scares a lot of the researchers away. And I know one or two now who have left the UK and they've gone elsewhere towards Europe. So it's definitely hurting our talent pool in terms of being able to do good research.
Yeah. Tim, are you seeing an effect at all in terms of your efforts or in terms of people you want to bring in maybe to Reuters, to the team here in London and Kent? Or?
Not so far. I think it's probably too early to tell. But I mean, when we recruit in our R&D team, we recruit across all our R&D locations, which include Europe and North America. So there's the option to go and work in our Toronto lab, for example. So far, I would say it's too early to tell.
Right. How about Jack? What do you find when you guys are trying to recruit?
I mean, so we're a distributed company, so we don't necessarily try and recruit in a specific location. I mean, I will say that the government clearly recognises the fact that London has benefited hugely from being a talent pool for people from across Europe and indeed the world. I don't think that they're going to kill that particular golden goose anytime soon. I don't anticipate that Brexit will erect insurmountable barriers to being able to attract talent here.
George, what do you tell clients if they come to you and say, well, how should I think about Brexit, potential rule changes around that, about financial passporting is obviously a big thing for a lot of fintech companies, a little less so maybe in the digital ledger space, but what are you telling clients?
Yeah, I mean, well, the first thing actually is asking them what they want to achieve. So a lot of these companies are in the UK because we still have the access to the European Union, of course, through the passporting, as you say. If passporting disappears, a lot of our clients, and Digital Ledger is a lot of these companies that we're talking to, they are launching financial products that potentially are regulated. The lack of passporting is a real concern for them. The only reason why they stay in the UK at the moment is because the UK is the English-speaking European jurisdiction. The reality is, as things change, they're going to be much more likely to push into mainland Europe instead of staying in the UK. I think the passporting is an absolutely fundamental part of what we need to achieve as part of Brexit. if we're going to be able to keep the fintech ecosystem and be able to maintain the, what we have in the digital ledger, in the distributed ledger technology space, and in the crypto space as well, we're going to have to be able to think about retaining passporting rights. One of the ones I would mention is ICOs. So, although ICOs don't benefit from passporting, of course, at the moment we have a very, very well harmonized financial services regulatory environment in the UK as across the European Union. If we start to diverge from that, ICOs who are looking for UK advice on the basis that UK advice then assists them with understanding the position on launching in the European Union. If we diverge from that, the UK is just going to become another jurisdiction that they have to check rather than being a jurisdiction that they check in order to give them a gateway to the entirety of the European Union. So that's another thing that concerns me. I think passporting and generally maintaining parity with the financial services regulation in the European Union is going to be crucial to maintaining London's position.
Interesting. One of the other things happening in the regulatory environment right now is GDPR. There's a lot of concern about what that may mean for digital ledger systems, but also some people saying, this could be great. Everyone needs a data governance solution. You need auditable data governance trails. Potentially a digital ledger could provide that. On the other hand, there's also, under GDPR, as you may be aware, a right to erasure. So if you're holding someone's personal data and they come to you and say, we don't want you to hold that anymore, you have to delete it from everywhere it exists. And that can be a problem, particularly on a distributed ledger. I mean, Patrick was saying earlier that some of these things, it's really may not be possible. And also, it's not really a very future-proofed idea, because who knows what's going to be possible 40 years from now, and where some of these things, a copy of the ledger may still exist somewhere on the network, that you're unaware of quite a while.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of people saying, okay, why don't we put healthcare records on the blockchain? But if you consider what the blockchain does, all the blockchain does is that you have a set of computers, so like thousands of computers, that all have the same copy of the database. I create a block, I send it to the network, and I'm effectively doing a batch update on every single computer in this network. So all I'm doing is replicating data. So if I put health records there, I'm replicating health records across thousands of computers. Now you can say, okay, let's just encrypt this. We encrypt it, nobody can read the records, but everybody can store it. There's some issues where if the private key is stolen, if that's leaked to the world, then everybody has access to all your health records. Another one is that, we have no guarantee this encryption will be strong in 50 years' time or 40 years' time or 30 years. I guess for health records, that's not a big issue because we might be dead by then. But if it's 30 years' time and quantum computers eventually pop up and they can decrypt this, we have no guarantee our encryption will last for 30 or 40 years. So, yeah, as you say, it's not the greatest idea in the world.
Yeah,
George. I was just going to weigh in on that. The GDPR, I think the right to be forgotten in GDPR and DLT, actually, I think it's slightly overblown, to be brutally honest. I think that it's not an absolute obligation to erase data on request. There are exceptions to that, and I think there are ways in which it could probably be worked around in the context of DLT. I totally agree with you, Patrick, though, about the concerns around the ongoing nature of the data and the fact that it's distributed so far. I think hopefully with things like zero-proof cryptography and other things like that will hopefully reduce those potential issues. The other thing I'd say about quantum computing is if that comes in and starts to break cryptography on the blockchain, we've got bigger problems because it's going to effectively be a game changer in the world of IT. Fundamentally, blockchain is just one aspect that's going to break as a result. Then you end up with quantum cryptography blockchains and that kind of thing.
That is an active research area now, post-quantum. Yeah.
Jack or Tim, do you have any thoughts on GDPR and what?
I guess one of the questions about GDPR, if this is a sort of London-centric debate, is what happens post-Brexit, because this is an EU-centric regulatory framework. The same could be said of other frameworks like PSD2, which has just come online. So where does London sit post-Brexit, and do we still enforce these frameworks? More on the technology side, certainly distributing, for example, health data across a network of machines, such as it's written to all of those, is problematic. But I think there's probably sort of halfway house solutions, much like, for example, the Constellation system and Corda, where you have a sort of a public and a private component. So, for example, you might have a smart contract where only the two transacting counterparts are privy to that information, and that type of solution might make it easier to remove or delete data when that request comes through.
Interesting. One last question before I sort of open up to the audience here. One is, I get the sense that London, has a very strong community on crypto and blockchain, and was certainly a leader in the space going back several years. And Jack sort of hit on this point that there maybe things have stalled from a regulatory standpoint. There's a sense that maybe also in terms of technology development, London is not on the cutting edge, or in terms of the sort of financial product development, not on the cutting edge. So you have Switzerland really plowing into ICOs and a lot of ICO activity in the US. There's a little bit of the sort of latest flavor of digital ledger keeping with these DAGs, and that's not really happening in London. Some people say, who cares? But I mean, it's sort of, there's a sense maybe that we're not kind of keeping up with whatever the cutting edge is. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. I mean, maybe we'll start with Jack, and maybe Patrick has some thoughts on what's happening academically here as well. So.
I think George hit the nail on the head about the certainty and the clarity around regulation. Many people say that you can't have a viable blockchain without a token or a currency of some kind. I disagree with that personally, but what I will say is that a lot of the development of this technology is grounded in cryptocurrencies. So we, for example, took academic research into zero-knowledge proofs, we implemented it in a cryptocurrency, and then we partnered up with JP Morgan to deploy it into their enterprise Ethereum fork. So I think that right now at this point in time, it's unwise to assume that you can build a blockchain industrial base, shall we say, without at least partly embracing cryptocurrency. Now, you look at Luxembourg, you look at Switzerland, you look at the United States. You can argue about whether the bit license goes too far or not, but what you cannot argue about is the fact that it does provide a lot more certainty than there is elsewhere in the world. Singapore as well is doing a lot of research into this space. So yeah, I think certainty and clarity are the things that help foster and provide a foundation to build this sector.
Patrick, do you have thoughts on sort of where things are academically?
Academic in terms of, okay, so I'm a bit biased, I guess. Yeah. So I think we are a bit ahead of the curve in the UK. I mean, at UCL, we have, as I mentioned, most of the blockchain researchers in the UK, and Imperial has some as well. And we're also part of like a wider consortium. So UCL is part of the IC3, which includes Cornell, Berkeley, Technician, UIUC, etc. So no, I think we're very lucky to be in a very unique situation where we're a little bit ahead of the curve than other countries for research.
Tim or George, do you have any thoughts about sort of, are we sort of falling behind here?
Well, I'm UCL alumni, so I will echo those comments. But I think from an enterprise industrial level, we do a lot of collaboration with both UCL and Imperial in the blockchain space. So I think certainly one of London's strengths is its sort of academic.
Oh, it is, and even the student societies. I mean, even last night I went to a student society organised meetup at the London Economic School, or whatever the acronym is. Yeah. And they had the CEO from Cardano there, Charles. And that's like really impressive to get that type of speaker to a student society. So the societies are all over this. The students are really eager. And I mean, I get emails all the time from really eager undergraduates who just want to do blockchain projects.
My concern would be that when those students graduate and they decide that they want to work in this space, will they end up doing so here in London, the UK, or will they end up going to the United States or Luxembourg or Singapore or Switzerland?
Interesting. I want to open up to the audience, so anyone have any questions for our panel? Somebody does there. We can get a mic. Patrick will run around with a mic.
Hi guys, thanks for so many great points you're raising. I just had a question, like something I read a lot of articles about every day is, I can see here there's a lot of support academically, globally, from the ground up with crypto. I think it's wonderful, that's why we're all here. But what concerns me is the kind of approach that we're getting from the top, which is the central banks. You've got such a huge divide. You're talking about how JP Morgan's investing heavily in blockchain tech, but then you've got other ones like Goldman Sachs and Jamie Dimon calling it a scam. I do wonder how much they see this as a threat, or are they finally going to come around instead of fighting and potentially adopt this in the future?
I think it's a bit of sorry, I'll just jump in. I think it's a bit of both. So back in 2015, the banks were sort of like, always just want blockchain. we don't want cryptocurrencies, just blockchain, I know. And that actually, blockchain in a bank would solve a real world problem in terms of synchronizing all the different ledgers. But I was like, I mean, we go from 2015, 2016, 2017. I think the banks are a bit more accepting of cryptocurrencies. I mean, you will have more experience than me. But even for like IC3, I mean, they're funded by JP Morgan and several other banks. I mean, they get some sponsorship from them. So the banks are pouring money into the researchers to try to, understand it a bit more. And the banks have now caught up. I think they're well aware of how this works, or at least some elements are. Oh, go ahead.
Just to add to that, on the flip side, whenever we have clients coming in to launch digital currency businesses, the first thing that they always ask is, can you hook us up with a bank? Because none of them, and other people on the panel have already alluded to this, none of them can get a banking relationship in the UK, and I'm not overestimating that. There are so many digital currency businesses in the UK at the moment who cannot find a banking relationship to be able to just have a bank account. So a lot of them are moving to countries like Gibraltar. There's a particular bank in Gibraltar that will bank digital currency businesses. And there's a couple in Eastern Europe that will think about it, but their fees are extortionate. So that is, for me, it's the number one problem with the UK at the moment, is the banking relationships with digital currency businesses. They might be interested in doing their own thing with digital currencies and with blockchain, but there's an issue at the moment around whether or not they're actually willing to bank these businesses. And a lot of the time it's legitimate. They don't want to bank these businesses because there are potential concerns with fraud or just generally the cost of acquisition of the customer being too high. But equally, that means that the government needs to step in order to make sure that this ecosystem is actually supported by the banks.
I think that's where the application of AML and KYC regulations to cryptocurrency businesses and if necessary, blockchain businesses where appropriate, would actually be helpful. It's kind of ironic, and the FCA has called this out themselves, that there are companies in the FCA sandbox, experimenting with blockchain technology, but when they go and try to get a bank account to receive investment or whatever, the banks say no purely because the name blockchain is in the name. So I think there's a dichotomy, and not to bang on about it yet again, but clarity and certainty, I think, is the watchword here.
Tim.
So it'll make your shares go up, but you can't get a bank account.
I would say there are some reasons to be positive. The Bank of England has a blockchain research group, and I think they've recently published something with UCL on attempts at putting sterling on blockchain. So I think there's positive noises. Mark Carney a couple of days ago said some not so positive things about Bitcoin. He sees it as having failed in its aim to be used as cash, which is quite hard to argue against, to be honest. So I think they have one eye on the future, but certainly the noises from Mark Carney, he's quite a pragmatist, and he'll say what he thinks. But I broadly think he's quite supportive of blockchain as a technology, and that the efforts of that research group would underpin that, I think.
No, yeah. So I know and UCL, I know it's the Glass Houses project, so they definitely work with the bank. I mean, that's what I'm funded on at the moment. Yeah. So it's definitely with the Bank of England.
Great. I'm sorry we're going to have to wrap it up there. We're out of time, actually, but I'm sure the panelists might be around after if you want to come up to them and ask them anything else. And thank you all for listening.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thank you, gentlemen. Now we actually have a small change in the schedule. George?
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
I'm staying?
Yeah? You're staying. And, the thing is with lawyers, they need to be billable. And George was supposed to speak in an hour or so, but that's an hour of lost money. So we move him forward right now. So now, right here, you're not billable. And then afterwards, you can just turn on the clock again and make money. George,
Okay.
take it away.
Take it away. Do we have slides? Slides? We do? That's not me.
That's not George.
That's me. Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm 5.50 an hour, I think. So I'll pick that up afterwards. I'm here to talk about cryptocurrency and regulation. As you can imagine, being a lawyer. So I'm from a firm called Simmons & Simmons. We're actually based in this building. I'm on the third floor. So nice and easy for me to get here. But over the last 2 years or so, I've been focusing on cryptocurrency and blockchain, which is a very interesting area to actually have to advise on. I think lawyers, certainly in the City of London, are used to certainty. And I think, as you've got from the previous panel discussion, certainty is a scarcity here. So it's been a really interesting
I don't want to use the term journey, but it's been an interesting ride to be able to say, to be able to look at the regulation and try and work out how it applies to this brand new world. So just to kind of illustrate it, I'm sure many of you will know what I'm doing. How do I get the slides to move on? Is that working? There we go. So how do you regulate something where the technology means that that cat is worth over $100,000 US? Have any of you come across this? I'm sure some of you have seen. So this is Genesis, the CryptoKitty. So CryptoKitties, for those of you who aren't familiar, is a blockchain-based game where people can buy unique digital cats that they all have different different sort of attributes and things like that. This is Genesis, the very first CryptoKitty. Now, CryptoKitties subject to a huge amount of hype about 2 months ago, which led to Genesis being sold for $115,000 US, I think. So, how do you, as a lawyer in this market, how do you regulate a market that can create something like that so quickly and create value out of nothing, out of a digital cat? It's just insane. So, I mean, it really is. So you have to think about, firstly, when you're looking at regulation in the sector, look at the speed of development versus the speed of regulation. And the previous panel, one of the panelists talked about how the regulators are actually moving very slowly. I think actually it's a natural thing for regulators to do. You need to stand back and you need to see how something develops, and you need to work out how you're going to regulate it. You can't take a knee-jerk reaction and either shut the market down or try and regulate it in a way that just doesn't work. So you have to take it at a certain speed. But at the same time, this market is moving about as fast as we've ever seen. And so it's incredibly difficult for regulators to be held to account. I think actually in the UK, we're actually doing quite well at sort of standing back and taking a cautious approach, making sure that, that when the time comes, we'll be regulating a market that is relatively well established. So why is it so difficult to regulate beyond the kind of, the fact that this market moves so quickly? No respect for jurisdictional borders. So cryptocurrencies, obviously, they don't sit within a particular country. So it's difficult to regulate something where if you just regulate it in one country, it'll just pop up in somewhere else. It's a bit like squeezing a balloon, right? You can make one bit smaller, but the other bit just gets bigger elsewhere. So how do you regulate something that just moves underground? And that's the issue that China's currently dealing with. They're trying to prevent people from being able to access cryptocurrency websites. But at the same time, the Great Firewall is trying to stop that. But at the same time, these are all very tech-savvy people who actually find that the Great Firewall isn't that hard to get around, difficult to regulate. Inability for regulators to keep up, so it's the speed of development, as I mentioned. These things are just very, very difficult to keep pace with. If you want to create sensible regulation, you've got to make sure that you're watching the market, but you can't move too quickly or else you'll create something that just isn't very viable. They don't fall within any pre-existing boxes. So regulators are trying to apply existing regulation to something brand new, unusual, and quite interesting and quite difficult. That's proving very difficult for regulators, and they're having to skill up very, very quickly. It goes back to the point around speed of development. The regulators are actually struggling to be able to understand the market, and understandably so. I'm in kind of the same position in that whenever I come into work in the morning, I have to read the news, because if I'm meeting someone that day to talk about an ICO, I need to know what's just happened in South Korea. I need to know what's just happened in Singapore to understand what they're going to be able to do when it comes to launching in those countries. Something that we're not very used to as lawyers, to be working outside of our normal jurisdictional borders. And diversity of use. You can't just pin down cryptocurrencies or ICOs into one particular box. Certainly they don't fall within a pre-existing box. They certainly don't fall within one new one. They fall within many new ones. The diversity of cryptocurrencies in the markets is huge. So, and it's the same with ICOs. Every token is different. So every token needs to be assessed on its merits. That's very difficult for a regulator to be able to create the boxes that they would normally create. Shares, contracts for differences, bonds, debt, all that kind of stuff. Those are pre-existing boxes that you can put something within. It's difficult to do that with a market like this that moves so quickly. So who's doing what across the globe? So we've already mentioned this a little bit on the panel session just now. We're looking at all the different countries and kind of the diversity of approach. So the first one would be welcoming them in. So looking at places like Gibraltar, Switzerland, Malta, actively trying to regulate this, actively trying to get to a point of welcoming the business in a sensible fashion. A good way to a good example of this is Gibraltar, and I was out there last week meeting with some lawyers who are at the forefront of this of the regulatory process within Gibraltar. What they're trying to do broadly is to create ICO regulations that put obligations on sponsors. So professional sponsors in the market who will actually review ICOs that are coming to market and putting their stamp on them. So they're regulating sponsors rather than the ICOs. That's the current discussion point. The reality is, though, that puts a lot of onus on the sponsors, and a lot of the ICOs that are being launched are, they're being run by very early stage companies. It's difficult for a sponsor to put their stamp on it, so it's going to be interesting to see how that works. Switzerland, I think everyone knows, has just broadly got open arms. They're trying to make sure that the regulations they've already got fit with ICOs, and Malta's doing a very similar thing to Gibraltar, probably about 3 to 6 months behind. So that's welcoming them in. They're trying to get the legitimate end of the business, trying to make sure that all the ICOs that are being launched now that aren't fraudulent are going to come to Gibraltar, they're going to come to Switzerland, they're going to come to Malta. Then you've got some companies that are making the right noises, countries that are making the right noises. So Singapore, obviously, it's a relatively well-established ICO environment. They haven't necessarily regulated specifically for it yet, but they are definitely welcoming. And South Korea as well, they've kind of flip-flopped. I think 2 weeks ago, South Korea were being very negative. About a week ago, we had some statements that suggested that maybe actually South Korea was going to be the next big ICO venue. So it's difficult to see, but at the moment, I think I'd say they were probably making the right noises. Cautiously watching, so I put the UK in that bracket. So we haven't done anything radical. We've told everyone to be careful if you're going to invest in an ICO, but we haven't outlawed them yet. We've told companies who are launching tokens to make sure that they are considering financial services regulation to work out whether they're launching a regulated product or not. Cautiously watching. And then most of the rest of Europe falls within that bracket as well. Broadly negative, I'd say the US. So the US is certainly, they're making a lot of noises that would suggest that they're not that happy about the market, the ICO market in the US. There's obviously been some regulatory enforcement. They were the very first ones to actually act. Back in July last year, the case came out around the DAO, where they suggested that was actually going to be an issuance of securities. And then since then, you've had the SEC a few weeks ago saying that actually, in terms of the ICOs they've reviewed, they haven't seen an ICO that they didn't consider was a security in the US. That's quite a negative statement, and certainly it has rattled the ICO market. A lot of people are now moving to exclude US investors. So that's an interesting one about broadly negative. It doesn't appear like they're looking to ban it. They're just looking to be quite sensible about the regulation. And then you've got outright hostility. Now, China, obviously outrightly hostile by essentially banning the entire thing, removing access to exchanges, both within China and overseas, banning ICOs, suggesting that all money that's been raised via ICOs should be returned to investors, all that kind of thing. Now, China's a kind of special case because actually they had a huge portion of the market back mid-late last year in the ICO market, and they really had to do something quickly because the number of fraudulent ICOs coming out of China was getting a bit ridiculous. The reality is that the best way to deal with that was just to shut it down. And that's what they've done. They have suggested that the market might reopen, but I guess for the moment I think they're just looking at how the rest of the world is developing and trying to work out how they're going to deal with it. There's clearly a huge amount of appetite in China for ICOs, and so they're wanting to be careful about how they actually reopen the market. So looking at ICOs themselves and the regulatory considerations, I think the interesting thing about the difference between ICOs and cryptos is that cryptos themselves are actually, if you look at the UK and most of Europe, they're actually not really regulated. The FCA in December came out and said that actually cryptocurrencies fall outside of the regulatory perimeter. So we've had confirmation from the FCA that actually they are not going to regulate cryptocurrencies at the moment. But ICOs are different because ICOs are actually launched by a central issuer, and they have investors who expect to get rights attached to the tokens. That regulators, as a result, have been much more careful about regulating ICOs and being a lot more prudent in terms of how the ICO market is developing in their countries. So some of the key things from my perspective when I'm advising on ICOs, these are the key things that I think about. So the first thing is that every company that's going to launch an ICO needs to consider the fact that quite often these things look like something very familiar. They look like an issuance of shares. They look like an issuance of securities. All these things need to be taken into account because if you're launching something that looks like a share and feels like a share, it may not be called a share, but it's going to be treated as a share. And in the UK, if you're doing an issuance of shares,
you treat that as something called a transferable security, and it needs to be launched in accordance with the Prospectus Directive, which is an EU directive that deals with how you sell shares to the public. So you either have to do an IPO, which no one in the ICO world is going to do, or you do a private placement where you can only sell to very limited set of investors, which again completely kills the idea of an ICO. So at the moment, in the UK certainly, launching a token that looks a lot like a share or a transferable security feels a little bit out of bounds. So they look like something familiar, therefore there's a danger that they're going to be regulated. Lack of consideration of financial services regulation is a key aspect of ICOs and launching ICOs. A lot of these ICOs that we saw early, mid last year, nobody really at the time was that concerned about security versus utility. Now it's like the number one question that everyone asks when they're launching tokens. Security versus utility. Does it fall within the definition of a transferable security or something else of that nature? Certainly I'm talking European Union here. Or is it just something that isn't a transferable security? It just does something like give you rights to discounts of products that are going to be launched in future, or maybe a right to participate in a particular platform. That kind of thing looks a little bit closer towards a utility, less like a security. Really, really important part of looking at an ICO, and it's the number one question that we ask when someone comes through the door asking for an opinion on whether or not their ICO is legal. But the other thing that a lot of people forget, that's the first question, security versus utility. But there are a whole host of other financial services considerations to take into account. You could be running a collective investment scheme, and that's a regulated thing. So you'd have to be authorized by the FCA to run a collective investment scheme, or alternatively a hedge fund. And these things might sound slightly unusual when you're thinking about them in the context of an ICO, but the definitions themselves of these particular vehicles are quite broad. And when you look at the way that tokens are actually being set up, some of them could well be a CIS or potentially even a fund. Tax and accounting issues. If you're raising money through an ICO, you have to bear in mind the fact that there are no existing structures, certainly in the UK, around how you deal with the tax on the proceeds. So if you're doing a share sale in the UK, the proceeds of a share sale are not subject to taxation. They don't go through the P&L, so they're not subject to a corporation tax. But the same can't be said for ICO, the proceeds of an ICO. Who knows exactly how the taxation, the tax treatment of an ICO proceeds is dealt with? It could well be subject to corporation tax, and that's obviously a key consideration in terms of how much of the proceeds you're actually going to get. Accounting issues as well. Some of the tokens that we've seen are launched on the basis of having profit shares. Now that looks a lot like a security to start with. It looks a lot like a share. But if you've got a pool of money that sits within the company is going to be distributed, you need to work out where those distributions come from in terms of the accounts, where they sit in the P&L and where they come out. Do they come out of revenue? Do they come out of profit? All these kind of things mean that you have to have accounting advice as well. And a lot of ICOs we've seen just haven't even considered that as an issue. AML and KYC is now fundamental. We will not advise on ICOs that don't have AML and KYC as part of their process. So even some ICOs that have whitelists for investors over $10,000 or something like that, we won't touch. All investors must be fully AML and KYC compliant, or otherwise we're just not going to be able to advise as a law firm. But equally, it's just not best practice to do that these days. There are companies out there that can do AML and KYC for ICO companies launching ICOs. It makes perfect sense that it would happen. Rampant speculation is another key one. Now, this is maybe slightly less of an issue than it was maybe 6-8 months ago, but still, a lot of ICOs make a lot of money because of the potential for rampant speculation on the secondary market. And the reality is that a lot of investors are looking at these things to make a quick buck, rather than actually being interested in the underlying investment opportunity. Because the reality is that a lot of these companies, and this is my second last point on this, a lot of these companies launching ICOs are actually very, very early stage. And the reality is they're probably 2 years before you would normally see them getting Series A funding from a VC or private equity house. So the reality is a lot of people who are piling into these ICOs, maybe they don't even have a particular interest in the underlying investment at all. They're just simply interested in flipping the tokens quickly. That in itself is an issue from a perspective of the company, because you have a genuine issue around the potential sort of reputational issues with the ICO. The more reputational issues you have, the more likely the FCA is going to come down hard on you. you have to make it so that your investors are more interested in actually keeping the token and actually investing in the underlying product rather than just trying to make a quick buck. We're starting to see ICOs that are structured in order to incentivize people to hold on to the coins rather than sell them quickly. That's a really, really interesting development because it's all about actually trying to launch an ICO that actually is designed to return value to the investors rather than just being designed to create a secondary market for a quick profit. Lack of genuine return of value to investors. Probably one of the weirdest parts of the ICO market is that the less rights that you give to investors who hold a token, the less likely it is that it's going to be a regulated instrument. So if you have a token that you sell that has no rights attached whatsoever, it doesn't look like a CIS, it doesn't look like a share, it doesn't look like a bond, it doesn't look like a contracts for difference. It looks like none of those things. It's just a token that you can sell in the secondary market and hope that the person next to you is going to buy it off you for more money. Curiously, that would not be regulated. And so but the reality is that that's probably the one thing that the FCA would really like to shut down because there's no genuine return of value to investors. As lawyers being asked to advise on an ICO of that nature, we wouldn't even touch it. It's just not the kind of thing that you want to be pushing out to market or having your name against. So that's broadly it in terms of sort of regulatory analysis in the UK and the European Union. It's a really, really difficult area to advise on. It's moving all the time. I once did a talk on this about 3 months ago. I wrote the slides, I went away for a week, and then I gave the talk as soon as I came back. The slides were entirely out of date by the time I got back from holiday, and I had to apologize to everyone that I did the talk for, because in that time, China had banned them, Singapore was going down the tube, it was ridiculous. The reality is that it's a really, really difficult area to advise on. It's tough to give a genuine opinion at the moment because of the lack of certainty. We talked about it a lot in the previous panel. But overall, the UK seems to be getting it just about right. We are treading a path between banning it or welcoming it with open arms. I think at the moment we're doing it about right. The one thing I'd say is maybe a little bit more certainty from the top would be helpful. That would really help us to be able to really expand the digital currency ecosystem in the UK. And the other thing I'd mention at the moment is the banks, but I've already talked about that. Any questions?
Thank you so much. You were talking about your hourly rate of $530, pounds probably.
Pounds.
So that's about $700. Thank you so much for investing that into this into this event. If you have questions, he's on the 3rd floor, so you can just go down and ring the bell. He's always open, but maybe he will put on his clock. Or how does that work? So if you're interested, I can't afford you, for instance, but I want to do an ICO. How does that work?
Oh, no, the slides have gone. But
yeah, slides have gone.
My email address is available from the organisers, or if you come and see me now, I'll give you a card.
But but do you pay from the first moment, or is there kind of like, oh, we have a coffee, I'll explain you a little bit?
I didn't know we were getting into terms already. No, I mean the first discussion is free.
Oh, that's
we're very altruistic.
Okay. Now the good news is the first discussion with me is also free.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well.
And better is even you haven't asked for my hourly rate, so maybe we can do something there. Are you investing yourself in ICOs?
No.
Crypto?
Yes.
Which
Only
ones?
A little bit. The weird thing about this is one final point. The weird thing about cryptocurrency is that it's not subject to insider trading regulations. So I can't go and buy shares because my company won't let me. But technically, it'd let me buy crypto all over the place. But the reality is I'm doing a lot of work that's very, very price sensitive in the crypto market. As a result, I don't own any crypto at all. I don't own any ICOs because I can't be seen to be influenced in some way or another. So it's kind of an independence thing rather than because I don't want to lose money.
Ah, okay. So, but so then you call me and say like, hey Patrick, I've seen this pretty interesting ICO. Can you buy some for me?
Technically not illegal. Yeah.
Not illegal.
Yeah,
no.
But definitely not what the kind of thing I'd actually do.
No. Oh, so you were not the one that called me 10 times yesterday. Okay. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Next up, and we're getting close to the end of the day already. So I'd like to ask you for another like 40 to 50 minutes of your attention before we head off to coffee, beer, vodka, I don't know, champagne maybe, whatever you like. Everything is fine. Next up is Dmitry. Dmitry Meshkov. He is based out of Moscow, and he's here in London. Could get a visa. That's also nice nowadays. Yeah, you're a researcher. You're also founder of the Ergo platform. You'll talk about the new generation of blockchains. Enjoy.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for your attention. So I'm really Dmitry Meshkov, and my topic today is the new generation of blockchains. So we are trying to build one new generation blockchain now that is called Ergo, and it's based on some research. And actually, I think that now there is quite a lot of good research that should be implemented, that can be implemented right now, and can make blockchains better, even right now. But before talking about the new generation of blockchains, I'll try to return to the time of a Genesis block of Bitcoin white paper, so like 10 years ago, and the main goal we are trying to achieve. We're trying to achieve a decentralized payment system, and for sure we are interested in some worldwide solution, not just a local toy for few people. So our goal is to build some worldwide decentralized payment system. But unfortunately, it's not possible right now. The main problem here is scalability. So regular blockchains like Bitcoin or Ethereum allows you to process like 10 transactions per second. For sure, that's not enough for worldwide payment system or even some local payment system like in for some local area, even for London. So for sure, this is not enough. What can we do? Well, there are some good protocols like BitcoinNG or its implementation in Waves called WavesNG, Bitcoin, and so on. That allows you to achieve much better throughput, like 100 transactions per second or even 1,000 transactions per second. My own opinion is that this number, 1,000 transactions per second, is a hard capacity for blockchains as they were described like 10 years ago with the same assumptions. Well, just because this number, 1,000 transactions per second, is the limit of regular internet connections. So if you are a user, you will be able to download like 1,000 transactions per second. With higher throughput, you won't be able to even to download all these transactions. That's bad. You can't join a network with your laptop or your smartphone. But we may achieve some better throughput with some different assumptions. So what assumptions can we use? Let's try to think about it. Well, first kind of assumption is like we have in a lot of cryptocurrencies now is to have some trusted third party, to trust to someone who downloaded all the transactions, process them, we trust that they are correct, and so on. With such an assumption, you can actually achieve worldwide payment system, but it won't be decentralized. So this assumption is not acceptable from my point of view, at least. Different assumption is like in BitShares or quite a lot of forks and similar cryptocurrencies. Looks like every user of the network should have a very good internet connection, like 1 gigabyte per second network, 64 gigabytes of memory, and so on. So minimal requirements are very, very high. Well, at least I do not have such a hardware right now, so I can't join this network, And I don't think it's possible to call it a worldwide system because most of people in the world do not have such a hardware. minimal requirements there, I'm not completely sure, but like 57 gigabytes of memory. It's a requirement to join the network. So it's not a good assumption if we are talking about worldwide decentralized payment system. Yeah. The next idea is used in Lightning Network and other off-chain protocols is this assumption looks like every user should be connected, should be able to establish connection to any other user and should always be connected to a network, to a blockchain, download and validate blocks. It's quite interesting. I can't tell right now that it is a very bad assumption. Maybe it will work. Honestly, I'm quite excited about this area of research of all these off-chain protocols. I think we will have an answer quite soon, whether it's a good idea or it won't work. We are more or less close to some production prototypes we can use, try to pay with Lightning Network. Let's see. But in Ergo, we decided to have a bit different assumption that miners, people who create new blocks, have high-end hardware, quite a lot of memory in it, and so on, while regular users should be able to validate everything on a low-end hardware, on their laptop, mobile phone, and so on. Again, 10 years ago, in Bitcoin white paper, blockchain was described as a one-layer peer-to-peer payment system. So all the parties are the same. It doesn't matter whether you are just a user who wants to pay or you are a miner who create new blocks. All parties should be the same. And the Bitcoin blockchain based on this idea, and most of blockchains right now. But actually, you can achieve some benefits if you have different assumption that the miners have much better hardware than regular users. But the important thing here that we do not want regular users to trust miners. So we do not need any trust. So it's still decentralized. Because if we'll trust somehow, it won't be decentralized. But we should be able to join the network with our smartphone, and without any trust to other parties, to miners, we can validate everything and be sure that this payment is correct and so on. The main idea is quite similar to already discussed today, zero-knowledge proofs and so on. So miners do some additional job to provide the proof that their work is correct. And this proof is much lighter, much easier to validate than to redo the job. So regular users should be able to validate proofs, random blocks, that they're correct on their low-end hardware, on their smartphone. For sure, these miners will do some additional job. It's not some huge increase of job for them, while this will allow regular users to validate everything much faster and much more efficient. I'll describe how is it possible in such example. So in current blockchains, miners contains the blockchain, blocks. Blocks actually have two parts: a block header that is quite small, like 80 bytes in Bitcoin, and the block body that is much bigger, 1 megabyte, so 1,000 times bigger. Miners keep all this data structure, the blockchain, and actually they also need a state, a current state of a blockchain. Well, in this simplified version, I show that it's just a map from public key to a balance. So to validate random transactions, they should know current state of their system. In Bitcoin, this state is called UTXO set. In Ethereum, this state is called world state, and so on. So it exists in any blockchain. It's just required to validate blocks efficient. What can we do with this state is to make it authenticated. So we can build some sort of hash tree on top of this state and put this root hash to block header. This is already done in Ethereum, for example, and it allows regular users to keep just this root hash, do not keep this whole state, whole data structure, and to validate that actually transaction sender had these coins. So miner can create proof that this public key B had 384 coins at this point of time, and if you are just a regular user, you can validate that that is correct. That user actually had these coins at that point of time, and that's enough to validate transaction. You can validate all the signatures and so on, but actually you can also validate this proof that some user had some coins. That is good, but actually that's not enough because every transaction changes state. And at the next block header, root hash will be different, and regular users should be able to validate that miners didn't add some coins to themselves, and that the only changes that were made to this state data structure are the same as described in transactions. So if you just had one transaction from user A to user B, we should be sure that A balance decreased by 10 coins, B balance increased by 10 coins, and no more changes were done in the state. Ethereum data structure did not allow to prove this, but there are some improved hash trees that allow to do it. And actually, we wrote a paper about such a data structure and presented it last year at Financial Cryptography Conference. That allows users to validate that new root hash is correct. After that, blockchain validation process looks as follows. So when miner applies some transactions to block and to his state at block n-1, he changed some balances, he calculates new root hash, and he provides a proof of this application correctness. Regular user can only keep this root hash just 32 bytes at block n-1, get proof and transactions, verify balances, verify that transactions are correct, and calculate new root hash at block n. So actually, all the data regular user need to keep in his local storage is just a root hash, just 32 bytes. This headers chain, yeah. Headers chain is much smaller than a full blockchain. So for Bitcoin, it's like 50 megabytes of data, while full blockchain is like 200 gigabytes of data, or maybe even more. Now I'm not completely sure. So it's possible to keep this 50 megabytes in your local storage, even if it's a smartphone. Unfortunately, this size is growing. It's not so good. And in Ethereum, because of more frequent block, it grows faster and faster, much faster than Bitcoin. And it's still a big pain for initial synchronization with the blockchain. So if you have some blockchain, if you are going to pay in a shop with your mobile phone, well, you can't wait until you will download this 200 megabytes. It will take too much time to synchronize the network and start using it. Yeah. But fortunately, we have good ideas how to solve this, and these ideas have general name of proofs of proof of work and new version of this protocol called non-interactive proofs of proof of work. It requires block headers to have some special structure with links to different headers with extraordinary difficulty. We will always have some blocks with randomly much bigger difficulty than required, and we can go through this block of extraordinary difficulty. What is difficulty? What is good here that we need just fixed number of block headers to estimate that we are actually on the block on the best chain. We are synchronized with the network without any trust. So we can download few headers, fixed number of them, and be sure that we are synchronized with the network. This makes much better network. So you can just download this proof of work headers chain. It's like 50 kilobytes of data, and actually you need a root hash of a state, but it's already included to block headers. It's just 32 bytes, and you can validate everything. You can't mine new block, you can't create new block, but you can validate everything. You can start using blockchain right now. So just download 50 kilobytes. You can start using blockchain right now without any trust. And that's a cool picture from our Slack channel. It's Ergo Light node running on Raspberry Pi and powered by Solar in Ergo testnet. So without any trust to full nodes that are dedicated servers and so on, it's possible to validate all the job done. That's for sure. That's not all we need for new generation of blockchain. I decided to concentrate on this idea that's maybe the most interesting, for me at least, idea. We need more and more improvements for blockchain. You can try to read more on our website, on our Twitter channel, and some of my personal contacts. SlideShare, I think I'll put this presentation there. You can download and check it, and also my Twitter and email. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. So we're up for our last talk, and I'd like to ask Jonathan Keane from TechEU on stage. We're going to do a panel. It's the very last one, and after that, I promise, there's coffee, there's beer, there's food, but there's one more. I'm going to prepare the seats, but you can already start off. No?
Okay. So yeah, last panel of the day, so I'm sure everyone's itching to kind of get out, so we're going to take it easy, get through this conversation. It's got a broad topic on blockchain, like a blueprint for a future economy, so we're keeping it quite broad. So we have a couple of speakers coming up. We want to talk about various applications of blockchain in the economy, as well as issues from a technical point of view and also from an economic point of view. So we have quite a varied speakers. So if they could all come up now and take a seat. So perhaps just to start, maybe Peter at the end, if maybe just each do a quick introduction, who you are, what you do, and just, I mean, you've all been on stage already today, but maybe just a quick introduction just to refresh people's minds.
Yeah, I'm Peter Todd. I'm an applied cryptography consultant, as in I help you apply your cryptography to real problems.
Dimitri?
So I think you remember me. I just gave a talk. I'm Dmitry, and I'm a researcher and developer of Ergo platform.
My name is Juan Garay. I gave a talk this morning. I'm a professor at Texas A&M University, and I've been to research labs during most of my career, IBM, Bell Labs, AT&T Labs. And I work in cryptography, cryptographic protocols in general.
So the topic is like a blueprint for a new economy with the blockchain. Starting with you, Peter, you mentioned using cryptography and blockchain to solve real problems. Just from an economic point of view, from the economy, how we live our lives, what kind of stuff are you working on in that space as far as solving real problems?
Well, I mean, the sort of more research stuff I'm doing, I mean, like, open time sets I just showed is really about just, incremental improvements of being able to reduce reliance on, trust, really, and better auditing and so on. Things like better protocols to move tokens around. I wouldn't necessarily say all this stuff's transformative, but incremental improvements can add up to something big in the end.
And when it comes to building the technology for blockchain technology that can be applied to, obviously we talk a lot about the finance sector, but obviously we want to talk about the non-finance use cases as well. Whoever wants to jump in first, what kind of goes into building that system first for you? You've discussed a lot about trustless systems. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so one of the things, I work more on the foundational aspects of blockchain in this case. So this is a truly disruptive technology. Let me ask a quick question. How many of you think that you really need a Genesis block to build a blockchain? Raise your hands. Is the question, so there's 1, 2. So everybody else means they don't, you guys don't know, or you're oblivious, or?
I think we should ask that question as well, because I have no clue.
Okay, so blockchain, right? We all know that there was this article in the Times of London publishing, I forget what the text said, but that's the Genesis block, right? Was that really necessary? Was really necessary to have a Genesis block to start building a blockchain? Is that question clear?
No, yeah, the question is clear. I think you should have a third option. You should have, I have no idea in there as well, because that's me. Because I hope you can tell me.
Right, so this is an interesting thing. So this relates to Ellie's talk this morning about trusted, having a trusted party, having a trusted setup, building an economy or a financial instrument and stuff, right? So here we have a situation in the case of a Genesis block where there was a trusted party, arguably the Times of London, right, that published an unpredictable string out of which the blockchain could be built. Is that clear? So it was unpredictable. So from the sky came the string says, this is trusted because, nobody could have predicted it, arguably. So we can just all start, it's a fair game now, right? Everybody's going to start mining on this string. Okay? So that was taken as a given for a while. But the interesting thing is you don't really need this. Okay? You can start mining from scratch. Okay? So this is very interesting because now you have you don't need trusted setup to start. And let me highlight what the issue here is, that if you're an adversary, taking care of your own interest, you know that it's going to happen. You can start mining way ahead of time, right? So you're going to be ahead of the game. When the other guys, the honest guys, start mining. So now we start. The guys already have done their homework. They can control the blockchain any way they want. Okay, is that clear? So it turns out that you don't really need it, which is very interesting. So no trusted setup for the blockchain. And you can then start building, blockchains, applications. You can add crypto to it. And then you get the, type of things that the Zcash and all these new applications that, throw crypto, advanced cryptographic protocols made more efficient and scalable on top of this public ledger infrastructure that we can build from scratch. Okay, and on top of that, it's permissionless, meaning that anybody can do it, right? In some sense, you download the software, start mining, and you start contributing. So that's pretty amazing in terms of foundational aspects or technical aspect you need to build new things. Can I say something?
No, I wanted to kind of get into Dimitri because you put your hand up earlier.
Did I jump in? Or?
No, because just when you asked the audience to put hands up, you did put your hand up saying
okay.
you need a Genesis block. Do you have any response
I want to say something else before.
Oh, yeah, sure.
So you want me to answer a question?
Juan wants to finish his point first, and then you'll come in.
Okay, new stuff. So we know, everybody knows about proofs of work. That's a Bitcoin blockchain. That's a very powerful primitive. In fact, it's been around since 1990, early 1990s. In case you don't know this, Cynthia Dwork and Moni Naor, they came up with this idea, and the idea was to, have somebody who wants to send you spam mail. He had to invest some effort. Okay, that was the original application of proofs of work, also called cryptographic puzzles. Right, so you really have to save a moderately hard problem in order for me to read your email. So it shouldn't be free. If you don't want to jam my mailbox, you should not be able to do it. So this primitive goes back to early 1990s. Okay, we're talking about like
1992, I think, yeah.
1992. Yeah. We are 25 years afterwards. This is interesting. We don't really know exactly what this primitive entails compared to other foundations of modern crypto. I'm talking about one-way functions. Okay, in turns out you can build stuff based on totally different primitives, and we don't know exactly the relation with these very classical cryptographic primitives. So I think that's all very exciting, and it's going to allow us to do things that are off the chart.
Did you want to jump in, Dimitri?
I absolutely agree that it's an interesting question, yeah. But we have a lot of options how to try to do it, and even this trusted setup problem. Do you like how it was done in Zcash, this trusted setup ceremony?
Is Eli around, or?
So.
No, so what they did was essentially, there's another thing in crypto called secure multi-party computation, where you can compute things in a distributed manner so that you don't have to trust anybody. You only have to trust a fraction of things. That's essentially the type of computation that. So that's cool.
But they need apples to oranges here.
What's that?
I think you're comparing apples to oranges here.
What's that? Why is that?
Well, I mean, the point of something like the Bitcoin Genesis block quote is not that it's trusted. It's quite the opposite. It's that it's easily verifiable. This is a public thing which any one of us could go down to the local library and get, the right newspaper and get good evidence that that quote existed when it did.
Yeah, but you still have to trust. I'm not saying that this might be totally, practically relevant. You still trust that newspaper was trusted and nobody leaked ahead of time.
But I mean, this is like making the argument that how can you go even trust that there's an audience here? What if you're actually in a dream and, some Elon Musk AI fantasy is simulating everything? That's quite different than, say, the Zcash trusted setup where I and a few other people, some of whom may even be in this room, could just go put a backdoor in and you'd never know.
I think we are speaking different languages here.
Yeah, I think so.
You need to solve these problems, to do things, applications in a distributed manner. There are things you can do with trusted setup, things you cannot do. That's probably impossible.
Well, I mean, I think
the interesting thing about this aspect is, again, it might not be totally practically relevant, but it's that you enable new functionalities, enable new ways of doing things. So, again, there was this Genesis block, which is cool, it's verifiable. You can just say the Times of London is it's okay, we're going to work on this. But the interesting thing for me is that that's not needed. And it's not known how to do things this way using classical cryptographic primitives.
What do you think classical cryptographic primitives are?
If I can just come in quickly, just break it up. as far as a Genesis block or something you said is verifiable, is that not necessary if we're going to talk about use cases for the economy, whether it's in financial use cases or in land titling or various like supply chain, wherever it may be? Shouldn't there be a Genesis block, something at the root that can be verified?
Well, land title is actually a good example of this, where inherently in a land title system you do have something akin to a Genesis block, and that at some point you can go say, here is what we will agree on is sort of our common non-cryptographic, so the transition between the cryptographic and the the non-cryptographic and the cryptographic, where we say, prior to this, we decided who owned what land using some other way. I know maybe we came in with force with a bunch of guns. Maybe we transitioned from paper-based record. And now we agree on this cryptographic thing, and then we move on from there. But unless you can go and make that a common agreement, I mean, all bets are off. Which really in the nitty-gritty gets down to, all right, I have a house. I want to sell you the house. What software do you download to verify
that? Dimitri, again, do you want to jump in there?
I'm not sure that I should add something.
Okay.
I think we might continue with the next questions if you want. I don't want to add something right now.
Are there any other? Okay, fair enough. Are there any other particular use cases that would need that kind of similar thing to land titling, as far as the? If anyone else wants to jump in as well.
I think all this stuff does. I mean, if you and I can't agree on some kind of basis of reality, we're just not going to be talking the same thing. I mean, cash is the same way. When I go pick out a 10-pound note, you and I have some common agreement on what that actually means. This is just an inherent part of these systems.
I guess the key point is there's more than you and I, and the thing, it's deeper than this. But there are a bunch of participants, and the thing is, you think everybody is going to be honest to agree on something, and some people might not be. Some of the participants might not be.
But we might have some protocols for this trusted or semi-trusted setup when, if at least one participant is honest, then this, for example, randomness is truly random. Yeah.
No, not in the case where some of the participants are actively malicious. So in fact, you need a majority of good participants to be able to generate a random string.
Yeah, if they are active, but we can verify if something went wrong, yeah? So we can create a protocol right now between all these people with the idea that if they follow the protocol, yeah, and at least one of them created really random string and don't try to manipulate them, then we'll have a truly random string, yeah?
Okay, so that's one scenario. It could be more complex than that. Not everybody would have to be in the room. They could be distributed. You have a bunch of participants trying to do something. The point is, would you have to trust? What level of trust would you need? To do this ceremony thing, you need a fraction of those participants to be honest. It's called secure multi-party computation. That's what you're trying to generate from scratch. In Zcash case was, you need those to generate these parameters for the zero-knowledge proofs that they use. And that happens in other cryptographic protocols. It's just cool, you can do it. They did the ceremony thing.
I put it, that doesn't really happen in other cryptographic protocols. I mean, certainly it does in theory, but Zcash, what made it so amazing was that it was so unique. It was one of the very, very few examples of a multi-party trusted setup thing that's ever been put in production, precisely because these things are so scary, we always avoid them. This is why Bitcoin did not start with something like that. It started with a very simple, auditable thing, the exact opposite of trusted.
Russ, that's fine. You can add auditing, you can destroy stuff after you do it. That's cool, and that works. Conceptually, right, I mean, that's tough. You cannot do it unless you have a majority of good participants. You try to understand things, right? You're going to build things. You're going to build an economy based on sound, technical. So you have to understand what things you can do or you cannot do. If you are relaxing the requirements and say, well, I can do this, but I'm aware what's happening, you have verifiability and stuff, right? So that's cool. We go ahead. but we have to be aware, we have to know what we're doing. So that's again, might not be practically relevant. But
yeah,
there's something that is the science.
That don't exist.
What's that?
I think you're imagining requirements that don't exist for most protocols.
That's okay. So I know requirements. Okay, I know requirements. So let's move on.
Okay. Maybe from like a scalability point of view, I mean, as far as deploying this thing, I keep going back to land titling as an example. From a scaling point of view, how far away are we from like using this as a regular way of proving our land? I know countries like Sweden, for example, are quite forward-thinking on this, but from a scaling point of view, how far are we from using this for something like land titling? Or
well, I mean, I'll say it right off, like for trusted systems, you know, the last few slides of my open timestamps talk, timestamping talk, I don't think this is a hard problem at all, because it's very easy to use something akin to conventional approaches to scaling databases, and retooling this a little bit to go scale trusted / semi-trusted, and auditable systems that do things like land titles. What this comes down to is really simple, which is that if I have a cryptographic proof that I own some land, and I give you evidence that that is true, I give you that proof, you can go verify that digital evidence without having to verify every single other person's stuff. Many of these cases, and in cases where that doesn't, it isn't totally true, the moment you have some trust, you can do things like say, well, we have some auditors who we trust to go do some of that auditing work, and then we'll split up the auditing work across, say, 100 different servers. And individually, they might only audit some of it, but collectively, they've audited the full thing. We just don't do that in Bitcoin because the requirements are a little higher. We assume we can't trust anyone other than, our own computers, and our own ability to know that our code's correct. But that's a very, very, very strict requirement. I don't think it's needed for most blockchain applications.
I think it's good, actually, to have these requirements. It's a security, It's not just some unimportant stuff. So I think we can't decrease our level of security. So this requirement is really very strong. I agree. Yeah, we just trust our hardware and software. It's not so good already, actually, but why not? Well, we can build systems that have such a low requirements. Why should we have more? Why should we ask more? Yeah.
Well, because a lot of the time it's completely irrelevant. I mean, when you're talking about, say, shares in a company, the reality is it's a centralized system. It's shares. It goes back to a company. I mean, right there you have a trust model, which isn't like Bitcoin. It isn't, well, this thing can exist without trusting anyone. You have to go trust some people. And trust with some balances and legal checkpoints seems fine to me. And I don't think we're going to gain that much by screwing up our scalability when we can get a much better sort of intermediate. We have much better auditing than we used to. And we still end up involving a bit of trust. Seems like a reasonable compromise.
Okay, I agree with you. At some point, that's really true that now people are trying to use blockchain for everything, and even for areas that are not good and do not need this blockchain at all. This is quite a good topic of research. When do we need this and when we don't need, actually. But blockchain is a good example that we can build a system with such a low requirements. We should just trust to hardware and software. And actually, we can't even trust our hardware. These backdoors in Intel processors. Yeah. So it's not so good requirements at all. But yeah, we should for sure discuss and research when do we need blockchain and such trustless system, and when more common solutions are much better.
Let's jump in. Final remarks. We have a few minutes left.
No, I don't have much to add, except that it's important to understand, what can or cannot be done, and then you relax if you know. You have to be aware of what you're doing, and then set up the foundations. And then, as I said, some solutions might not be practical, but you know this, and you understand why. What concessions are you making, and there might be a lot of stake on these new technologies, right? So you really want to know what where the vulnerabilities are and what that kind of thing.
And we just have about 2 minutes left, and I know everyone's eager to go get food and drinks, but if anyone has a question they want to throw in quickly while we have time? Not all at once. Okay, I think that's everything then for me. I just want to give it up for our panelists, and I'll talk to them today.
Thank you so much. And with this, we have come to an end of this magnificent day. It was a long day with a lot of information. I've seen many signs I had never seen before, which I should have recognized from my financial economic study, but my mathematical brain didn't compute. But yeah, I think it was really interesting. Some takeaways. I think we are here at the very beginning of what blockchain and cryptocurrencies can do for our mankind and for the world. And I think that's very exciting. So I hope the Binary District and the Blockchain Institute will continue with this event in 2019 and hopefully for years to come. I hope you all enjoyed the day. We're going to have drinks right now. They're offered by Primalbase. So Primalbase is the company that is actually turning this into a blockchain office space. So if you ever need to rent an office, you can do that here, and this will be your view. Thank you so much for everybody for coming over today. I hope to see you all at the drinks, and let's give one more round of applause for the Binary District and the Blockchain Institute. Thank you so much.